I'm Scott Caton. I am a priest in the Diocese of Rochester, and I am privileged to teach alongside the colleague whom I'm going to introduce to you. That is Dr. R.J. Stansbury. Dr. Stansbury has been a colleague of mine at Roberts Wesleyan College, where we both teach, just on the other side of Rochester. He's been a colleague of mine for at least 15 years there at the college. He is a remarkable friend and colleague, always has great things to say, as you'll see, whether it's speaking at a conference or teaching in his classes. He's very humble about this, but he is one of the, at least national, if not worldwide, experts on homilies and preaching in the Middle Ages. And that's what he's known for. He's known at Roberts Wesleyan as a wonderful colleague in the history department, a real leader in terms of committees and things that he does for us at the college. He in effect is a convert to the Catholic faith. I think he was baptized as a Catholic when he, very young, and then later, shortly thereafter, his parents left for a non-Catholic church, and that's how he was really raised. And so he re-entered the church just around the time, or slightly after the time that he came to Roberts as a colleague from his great PhD program at Ohio State, which was known in the Department of History at Ohio State, was known for many great historical research items, but especially medieval history, where he got his degree. So he, if you will, re-entered the church as an adult, just as I was a convert to the faith as an adult. And we share so many things together, not only a great friendship, but also many kind of similar pathways and similar stories. He and I both went to the Presbyterian Seminary, Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, although since I'm much older than he is, our paths really didn't cross, actually. We were not there at the same time. But when we wanted to hire a new historian at Roberts, we did a very big national search, and his name came right up to the top for what we wanted to have in the history department, and we've never been disappointed. He serves with me as the co-advisor, really, of the Catholic Student Association at the college, and he's just a model Christian. And through his influence, the Lord has used him to bring students closer to the Catholic faith. So I'd like to have you welcome with me Dr. R.J. Stansbury.
And it's not like I'm not interested in his talk, but I have to go to perform a wedding right now. You'll have to let me know how we did.
Well, thanks, Scott. I appreciate that. You mentioned Westminster, and I was thinking a little bit about my, my own journey and Dale's talk. And Dale, what was your topic again? I heard the word Puritanism in there somewhere, and the Puritans actually had a pretty influential role in my own conversion, believe it or not. One example, there were two things that come to mind. One was when I was in graduate school. I was taking a course in American religious history, colonial American religious history, and the professor gave us some source material, and one of those sources was a document from, I think it was 1652, I believe, somewhere in that vicinity, and it was a parliamentary decree that banned Christmas. This was under the, I guess you could say, inglorious reign of Oliver Cromwell, right? And yeah, they banned Christmas, and I thought, this can't be right. And then the other thing that comes to mind when I think of the Puritans and their involvement in my own conversion was a time when I was in England doing research, and I just decided to take a day trip from Cambridge up to Ely Cathedral, which is not far from there. And I love visiting these old, once Catholic cathedrals, and it ticks me off, of course, every time I go there and I see who's in charge of these cathedrals, but that's another story. But I went into Ely Cathedral, went into the chapter house, the monastic chapter house of this cathedral, and all the statues around that chapter house have their heads lopped off. You know, some iconoclastic Puritan, going in there and just lopping off the heads. And those two things, those are very important things that ultimately brought me into the Catholic Church. So I do thank the Puritans, although I do wish that, isn't there a statue of Cromwell outside the House of Commons? I wish someone would just lop off his head. But I think it's made of bronze, so I'm not sure they can do that. Well, anyway, I want to start by thanking the Rochester Chesterton Society for inviting me to give this talk, along with the bazillions here in Rochester, St. Irenaeus, and all the other folks that are listed in the program. This world of ours is filled with a number of isms, as it were, and I think it's useful to take a few minutes and to talk about some of these, and at the very least be aware of what's going on, and in particular how we might, as Christians, as Catholics, navigate these somewhat troubled waters in our own day. My good friend Lou Horvath asked me to talk a bit about atheism, and although, I don't know, I think Horvathism is a much more interesting oh, he's coming in now. He asked me to talk about atheism, and so that's what I'm going to do. I want to make a couple of preliminary points here from the outset so that you know a little bit about where I'm coming from. First of all, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a historian. So my intention here is not really to give you answers to the philosophical questions raised by the priests and the priestesses of modern atheism, particularly the so-called new atheists of the 21st century. I'll mention these folks a little bit later on because there's been quite an uptick in the interest in atheism per se, following the work of Oxford biologist Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, 2006, and also Christopher Hitchens in his book, God is Not Great, The Case Against Religion, from 2007. Now, interesting titles, huh? The titles of these books kind of remind me of Chesterton's comments in his chapter on the caveman in one of my favorite Chesterton books, The Everlasting Man. And you might remember this when he says, one of my first journalistic adventures or misadventures concerned a comment on Grant Allen, who had written a book about the evolution of the idea of God. I happened to remark that it would be much more interesting if God wrote a book about the evolution of the idea of Grant Allen. And I remember that the editor objected to my remark on the grounds that it was blasphemous, which naturally amused me not a little. For the joke of it was, of course, that it never occurred to him to notice the title of the book itself, which really was blasphemous. Or it was when translated into English, Chesterton says, I will show you how this nonsensical notion that there is a God grew up among men. And Allen's book, you may know, was published, I think, in 1897. And in those days, this is what we might call, for lack of a better way to put it, polite atheism back in those days. And although we know what some of these new atheists in our day think of Chesterton, I wonder what Chesterton would do with the likes of Dawkins and Hitchens. Anyway, my point is that I'm not really intending here to offer an answer to these pseudo-philosophic musings by modern atheists. I'm neither qualified to do so, and I really don't care. My original title for this talk was Atheism, whatever. I like that title. And that brings me to my second preliminary point, which is, well, an apology. My comments about the unbearable lightness of atheists or atheism, which is a sort of tongue-in-cheek reference to Milan Kundeра's book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, back in the 1980s. I have to confess that I've never really had the pleasure, or some might say misfortune, of really discoursing much with serious atheists in my time. I have, over the course of my spiritual and religious journey, thought about the interesting questions related to the existence of God, most notably in my own encounters with Aquinas in the context of my seminary training at Westminster Seminary. And over the years, I've encountered and dialogued with a number of people who are agnostic, people who are not that sure what they believe, but also not particularly hostile. And I've also had the opportunity to deal with a lot of Puritan types over the years. But as for these hardcore atheists, I just have not had the pleasure or misfortune of dealing with people of this ilk all that much. In part, I suppose, it's my own temperament. Again, this is an apology. I just really don't have that much patience for what I see as the kind of arrogance of militant atheism. Now, I realize that this is not a positive reflection of Christian charity. I get that. But one of the early influences in my religious life was the work of a Dutch apologist and theologian by the name of Cornelius Van Til, a Puritan type, by the way. You know him, yeah. And he was a professor at the old Princeton Seminary back in the early 20th century, and he left that seminary in the late 1920s to found Westminster in Philadelphia. Now, I'm not old enough to have studied with Van Til, but I did read a number of his works over the years. And he was an apologist by training, and one of his illustrations that I still remember is found in his little book on the defense of the faith. And he tells a story of an encounter that he had with a little girl and her father on a train ride to Holland. And the girl was sitting in her father's lap, and he must have asked her to do something that she didn't really want to do, and suddenly she jumps up and slaps her father in the face. And for Van Til, this episode illustrated the kind of arrogance and ingratitude of unbelievers and atheists who, on one hand, tout their own independence and autonomy, all the while sitting in, indeed supported by, the lap of their father. In order to deliver that slap in the face, this little girl, she had to climb up into her father's lap. And this just irked Van Til. People have to climb into the very lap of God in order to slap him in the face. They take advantage of the common grace that God has given to us as human beings, only in a fit of rebellion, slap him in the face. And as I said, this really bugged Van Til, and it confirmed for him the fact that atheism doesn't invalidate theism at all. How absurd is that, in fact? But rather it proves theism, because atheism is only possible given the premise of theism, that God exists, right? Now, for the Chestertonians out there, and I imagine there are a couple of you in the room here, that sounds very similar to one of Chesterton's most famous quotes: "If there were no God, what?
There would be no atheists."
Right. See, I knew there were some Chestertonians here. And in fact, I think Chesterton says it much better than Van Til ever did. Anyway, I just offer my apologies if I seem to take atheism a little lighter than perhaps it should be. So my goal here is to walk you through a few historical points about atheism that come to mind for me, and then perhaps suggest a few ways that we, as Christians, as Catholics, can be prepared for the handful of atheists unleashed on us today. Now, the first point I want to make here is that atheism, as we understand it, is by and large a modern concept. Yes, the term atheism was used in the ancient world, but it carried a very different meaning than it does today. We find atheism used among certain groups in the ancient world. The Epicureans, for example, come to mind. People who didn't believe in the gods as such. Or, even someone like Socrates, right, who was accused of atheism. But this particular brand of atheism was more of a political or even behavioral matter. It was an attack against the state, political treason, if you will, rather than something that stemmed from any deep-seated religious belief or active rebellion against the gods. Even if you look at the early Christians who were occasionally accused of atheism or being haters of God, they were judged as such more because of their behavior, not acknowledging the emperor as God, than of their beliefs. The Romans just thought it was odd that the Christians wouldn't throw a little incense on the altars to Caesar. And I dare say that it's not unlike the way we might feel about someone like, Colin Kaepernick, right, sitting down during the national anthem. The Romans just thought that these Christians were bizarre. Why can't you do this? This is not that big of a deal from the Roman perspective. But the ancient world was steeped in this idea that supernatural forces were at work all over the place. In fact, one of the things that disturbed ancient authorities about the Christians was that they couldn't imagine a single God being able to control everything, all the complexities of this world in which we live. The Romans, of course, had gods for everything, and the notion that one God could possibly run all that we see around us was just plain silly for them. So, in terms of the history of atheism, then, the notion of a division between the secular and the sacred that's so common to us today is really a modern concept, and not something that we typically see in the ancient world. A few institutions that survived from the ancient world to the modern world may help to illustrate what I mean here. For example, we have the Olympics, right? Just celebrated the Olympics, traditionally believed to have been started in 776 BC. Now, for us, the Olympics is purely a secular, non-religious, athletic event. It has political overtones to it in that nations send their best athletes to compete in a way that was similar to the Greek city-states that also sent their best athletes to compete. But the ancient Olympics was as much a religious event, that is, it was an event dedicated to the god Zeus, as it was an athletic festival. Our modern athletic events have no such religious significance unless perhaps you pull in Monday Night Football, which clearly does have a religious significance, and rightly so. All right. Another example might be the dramatic performances that were done in the ancient world and how those dramatic performances are performed today. Today, in just about any decent-sized city, you can see a play or a performance of some sort almost any time during the year, and in some major cities even every day. In the ancient world, in Athens, for example, theatrical performances were limited to a couple of days a year, and they were very closely connected to religious festivals, usually surrounding the god Dionysius. In our day, going to church and going to a play are two very different things, although, sad to say, that may not quite be the case anymore, but it's supposed to be at least something that's different. But if you were a Greek living in ancient Athens, this notion of this interplay between religion and dramatic performances was just a given. It was a given. It was just assumed that virtually everything you did as a culture had religious connotations to it. This was a world of oracles, of prophets, of omens, where you watched the flight of birds or read entrails to try to figure out what in the world these ancient gods wanted you to do. And so no one did anything of any significance without consulting the gods first. And the same is true for the Middle Ages. Atheism, as we know it today, simply did not exist in the Middle Ages. There were heresies, of course, and there were heretics, words that by and large now are lost to us in our world of religious pluralism, another ism. And so sometimes we find the word atheist in the Middle Ages being used in reference to heresy, but not in any modern sense of the term, with this radical separation between the sacred and the secular. I mean, even the famous proofs of Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica were not really intended to refute atheism as such, but rather they were an effort to demonstrate that God's existence was in fact rational, using Aristotelian logic. So to speak of atheism in the ancient or pre-modern world, while the term existed and was used here and there, it was a very, very different thing than what we see in the modern world or in what the so-called early modern period is. So I would argue that where we see atheism emerge is in the so-called early modern period of European history. That's where we really see this thing start to take off. In the period of the Italian Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and also in the French Enlightenment. Now, scholars vary as to which of these key historical movements witnessed the birth of atheism. It's probably more proper to speak in terms of when we begin to see the seeds of atheism sown, the Renaissance, the Reformation, or the Enlightenment. I want to say here at the outset that if atheism has anything to do with rebellion, when those seeds were sown, probably at the dawn of humanity, right, in the Garden of Eden. But fast forwarding just a bit, one thing is pretty clear, and that is that atheism seems to take root, or perhaps it's better to say at least begins to flower in an environment or culture where religious authority is openly and widely repudiated. So that said, it might not surprise you that I'm suggesting here that the can of worms of Western atheism finds its most fertile soil in the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Do I need to pause there to take cover? I'm not sure. I do teach at a Protestant college. So, but that's where I think this is coming from. The Reformation brought with it a profound rejection of historic and incarnational religious authority, the results of which I think we are experiencing today in the radical secularization of Western Europe and the gradual but clear decline of Christianity in the West. But just so you don't think this is my nutty idea, even the likes of Francis Bacon, in his little essay on atheism in the early 17th century, wrote the following. He said, "The causes of atheism are divisions in religion, if they are many. For any one main division adds zeal to both sides." You get that? One division, people just get hot and fight. Okay? But many divisions introduce atheism. So Bacon said that, not me, and he also, by the way, this is just a little tangent, but I like this, he said that a little philosophy inclines man's mind to atheism. Semicolon. but depth in philosophy brings men's minds about to religion. I love that quote as the sort of line against anti-intellectualism that's so prominent in some circles. So Luther, Calvin, and Melanchthon, and Zwingli, and the other principal players in the Protestant Reformation may have been filled with a lot of religious zeal in their efforts to reform the medieval Catholic Church. And there's no question, if you go back and read the Reformers, they were filled with a lot of zeal. And but that zeal, I think, at the same time drove a stake into the heart of Western Europe, the effects of which we are still feeling to this day. In the Middle Ages, the relationship between the church and the state was a tricky one. No question about it. But it's telling to me that while in the 12th and 13th centuries, it was the Pope who held the two swords of temporal and spiritual authority together. A delicate balance, and one that was indeed fraught with a lot of problems. But even Pope Boniface VIII, in 1302, wrote the following: "Both therefore are the power of the church, that is to say, the spiritual and temporal sword. But indeed, the latter is to be exercised on behalf of the church," that is the temporal sword, right? "And the former is to be exercised by the church. The former is of the priest, the latter is by the hand of kings and soldiers. But it will be at the will and sufferance of the priest." This close but delicate balance between church and state that characterized so much of the Middle Ages. What Boniface is suggesting here and expressing here is this balance, certainly not always maintained between church and state, as it was understood in the height of the Middle Ages, or at least before he himself was humiliated by the French king Philip IV. That's another story. But it's this delicate balance between the church and the state that by the time we get to the 16th century, and in the wake of the ecclesiastical crisis in Avignon and the Great Schism, that Europe, I think, is poised for a rebellion unlike anything it's ever seen. Slowly but surely, that stake is driven into the heart of Europe, even as it was posted to the castle church door in Wittenberg in October of 1517. This created a massive division within the European landscape, and most notably, a division between the sacred and the secular. The sacred gradually becoming characterized by the new priests of modernity as superstitious, emotional, irrational, and in modern times, bigoted and intolerant. The secular, on the other hand, as enlightened, mature, rational, and scientific. It's hard not to see in the rejection of the Catholic Church the rejection of all religious authority. And I mean no offense. Well, maybe I do. Remember, my initial apology is still in effect. Okay? But it's not hard to see in the face of 16th century Martin Luther, the face of the legendary Galileo, the invented late 16th and early 17th century poster child of this division between rational, secular science on the one hand and religious superstition on the other. I say invented, of course, because of all the myth surrounding Galileo that has crept into the picture, the historical picture over the years. Or even the 18th century Henri d'Holbach, the first self-declared European atheist, who even the more stated Voltaire, you've heard of Voltaire, even the more stated Voltaire repudiated him as a nut. That's my word, not Voltaire's word, but still, that's the idea. Or even our beloved Thomas Paine, who wrote that of the most clear and long-established conviction that the Bible and the Testament are impositions upon the world, that the fall of man, the account of Jesus Christ being the Son of God, and of his dying to appease the wrath of God, and of salvation by that strange means, all are fabulous inventions. That's Thomas Paine. Dishonorable to the wisdom and power of the Almighty. The deist as he was, Paine said, my own mind is my own church. That's remarkable. It's a remarkable thing to say. But it's not surprising because Luther said almost exactly the same thing. Moreover, it's not impossible to see in the face of the Reformation the face of revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. When Luther had the hubris to declare that the Pope was the Antichrist, by the way, that was the single belief that was shared across the Protestant sects in the 16th and 17th century. Not sola scriptura, not sola fide, not all these other things, but the single thing, the Protestants disagreed on just about everything, even from the beginning. The one thing that they all agreed upon was this notion that the Pope was the Antichrist. But if Luther had the hubris to declare that, one can almost hear the echo of 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who with equal, I think, self-appointed arrogance declared that God is dead. And once one throws off the authority of the Pope, it's not a far leap to see how one could arrive at the throwing off of the authority of the king, either by regicide or, what's familiar to us Americans, geographical and political separation. Now, I may be a little guilty of oversimplifying things here a little bit as I'm giving you some of this narrative, but the trajectory and the connections here, in my mind, are really quite plain. And Hilaire, what was that you did? Does that work? Hilaire Belloc, who, again, is no doubt familiar to some of you, in his little book on how the Reformation happened, well, I liked how he described the factors leading up to the Protestant Reformation. Here's another good quote. But the last factor, Belloc says, the hatred of the faith, though it was numerically by far the smallest, was so much the more intense, and was in the nature of a leaven which could rapidly infect all society once it was given play. We must remember that this hatred has always been present, Belloc says. That it is present today, most Catholics and all converts know well, though the world outside, the world that writes our official history, does not appreciate the presence of this hatred until it's excited by opposition. Such hatred, he goes on to say, is natural and inevitable. All energy polarizes, and the Catholic Church is the most powerful source of energy on earth. It provokes an opposite pole. Further, the Church is at issue everywhere with man as he is, restricting him always, and at some time or another, in nearly every man's life, violently at issue with pride, ambition, or desire. Over and above, and more powerful still, is as a provocative is the Church's claim to absolute authority and universal moral dominion. That this force of hatred was confined to a comparatively few in Europe before the defensive barrier of church organization broke down is true, but that it was potentially present in a very large number and might be spread like fire through whole districts, the event was to prove. Indeed, the most striking mark in the words and deeds that followed the catastrophe, that is the Reformation, is this intense, sometimes insane, passion against the faith. I love that line. Great line from an excellent book. If you've never read that book, I highly commend it to you. I teach the Reformation at a Protestant college, a Wesleyan college, and I confess that I use this book because I too am a rebel, and I thank God for academic freedom. So there you go. By the way, this separation between the secular and the sacred for us moderns sometimes comes to a head, and I find myself on occasion having to remind Christians about what happened long ago in the West. You see this come Christmas time, right? You see this sacred, secular divide exhibited in sometimes silly ways. On the one side, you find Christians getting all worked up about the removal of Christmas creches or crosses or Christmas trees or images of Jesus from public spaces, and how frustrating it can sometimes be when people refuse to say Merry Christmas to you, right? And I've been in this category myself on many times. And on the other side, the silliness is there as well, because you see secularists or atheists find themselves, in fact, celebrating Christmas, much to the delight of their otherwise poorly depraved children, right? Go figure. Prayer in school is perhaps another example when this divide rears its head, and people get worked up about this. And most recently, dare I say, the Supreme Court decisions regarding marriage. The difference with the Supreme Court decision on marriage is that in addition to being an affront to traditional religious beliefs, which it certainly was and is, it also, frankly, flies in the face of what should be the priorities of a secular state. That is, the preservation of an institution, marriage and family, that does what? Produces children, produces citizens. Now, I don't want to go down a tangent here, but it kind of boggles the mind that with all the talk about immigration, building walls from you-know-who, and the like, no one has mentioned that along with the immigration problem comes an equal and profound problem with national birth rates in the West. Do a Google search on that. You'll be shocked. Anyway, I'd like to see that part of a political campaign, wouldn't you? That'd be fun. Anyway, I have to remind yeah, can you see the drumster doing that? That would be interesting. Anyway, I have to remind folks every once in a while that it was 500 years ago that Luther in 1520 called for reform in his own German provinces. And when he called for that reform, he did not call on his fellow pastors, and he certainly didn't call on the Pope to institute any kind of reform, or any other bishop in Germany. Who did he call on? He called on the German nobility, okay, the secular lords and princes, and told them that the church was, in effect, their responsibility and in their hands. The state divorced from divinely appointed religious authority and placed in control of the church. What in the world did we expect would happen over the course of 500 years? What do we in higher education expect when on the one hand we collect federal dollars to subsidize our schools, and on the other hand we're told that we have to recognize diversity along the lines of sexual orientation or marriage equality? What do we expect? That genie has long since left the bottle 500 years ago, and it would take a miracle on par with the parting of the Red Sea, I think, to put it back. We live in a world where the sacred and the secular have long since divorced. And what we see around us is merely the natural outgrowth of those decisions made many, many centuries ago. All of that gets me to modern atheism. Now, modern atheism, the atheism that we know, or at least our somewhat familiar with, has also gone through a number of stages as well. In the 19th century, we have the works, most notably of people such as Karl Marx in political thought, Nietzsche's nihilism in the world of philosophy, all big names in their day that are largely ignored in the modern world. A running theme with the atheist priests and priestesses. And in the 20th century, we get to witness state-sponsored atheism in the political careers of Lenin, Stalin, and to a somewhat lesser degree, I suppose, Mussolini, not to mention the leftovers today from the Cold War. So the modern world finally brought us into the bright light of modernity, and thank God for that, right? The Reformation and subsequent modernism rejected what it thought was the barbarism of the so-called Christian Middle Ages, that dark period in European history that was dominated by a repressive and authoritative church and governed, as it were, by someone believed by many to be the whore of Babylon. Yet, the perceived barbarism of the Crusades, or even 100 Years' War, is nothing compared to the barbarism of chattel slavery in the 18th and 19th century, the 60 million casualties of World War II, 35 million casualties of World War I, and the Europe once dominated by a repressive and authoritative church is now, thank God, dominated by a repressive and authoritative state. From Stalin to Hitler to Mao to Pol Pot, Rwanda, Bosnia, and the list can go on. What a relief, right? Thank goodness for that enlightenment. Thank goodness we don't have that repressive church anymore. Come on. I mean, really, who are we fooling here? And if that's not enough, enter the so-called new atheists of the early 21st century, Hitchens, Dawkins, and others, who have popularized atheism in a way that Nietzsche could never have imagined. This is a populist atheism, and is, I think, troubling because it's not just an attempt at disproving or working through the tough, interesting in some regards, philosophical questions about the existence of God or moral absolutes as we find in the work of even someone like English philosopher Anthony Flew. This is a nasty form of atheism. A nasty form of atheism, filled with a renewed sense of spite and self-congratulatory conceit. These folks are like the petulant child who needed to use their father's lap in order to slap him in the face. Dawkins seems to think that anyone who disagrees with him needs to learn how to think. How arrogant. When Anthony Flew reviewed Dawkins' work, The God Delusion, he noted, this is Flew, he noted that while Dawkins had the honor of selling over 1 million copies, he did, I think, make the New York Times bestseller list at one point. What's much more remarkable than the economic achievement is that the contents, or rather, these are Flew's words, or rather lack of contents of this book, shows Dawkins himself to have become what he and his fellow secularists typically believe to be an impossibility, namely a secularist bigot. Helpfully, Flew writes, my copy of the Oxford Dictionary defines a bigot as an obstinate or intolerant adherent of a point of view. Now wait, I thought that this description was only reserved for the moronic practitioners of religion, right? But there you have philosopher against philosopher, okay? Dawkins' ideas have been shown over and over again to have fallen short on many, many levels. For example, he suggested if God is God, then prayer should always achieve the intended results of the suppliant. Well, again, I'm not a philosopher by any stretch of the imagination, nor am I the son of a philosopher. But I think that a sophomore philosophy student, regardless of his or her religious leanings, would likely know that God, or any supreme being for that matter, is not the same as a mechanical instrument governed by predictable laws. There's a whole lot of hosts. There's a whole lot of reasons, usually unknown to us, why God answers some prayers and not others. And frankly, the same is true for we human beings who are, remember, made in the image of God. We humans do things for all sorts of reasons. And our actions, in many ways, especially for our children, can be unpredictable. Think of how we respond to the requests that our children make. Do we always give them what they want? Of course not. Okay? And sometimes the reasons are too complex, even for the child. How many of you have ever used the reason, because I'm the mommy, that's why? I've used that. Not mommy, but well, we won't go there. But yeah, I mean, that's a common thing, right? That was God's response to Job, if I remember correctly. In other words, for Dawkins and his ilk, God is not God, but rather a being whose sole existence is to grant wishes. Dawkins' God is Barbara Eden. By the way, when I was 12 years old, I was in love with Barbara Eden. And I know some of you were too. Or we could look at how Dawkins picks and chooses his moral code, not wanting to connect with the implications of Darwinian relativist morality that have plagued much of the 20th and 21st centuries, but also not wanting to attribute moral standards to anything outside or above humanity. His choices, for example, to be kind to others, or not to steal, or not to kill, I guess we can be thankful for that. Those are his own moral choices, picked like apples off of a morality tree that he alone planted and grew. And again, one doesn't have to hold a PhD in ethics to recognize that once morality is seen as a mere human convention, once morality is seen as a mere human convention, whether evolutionary or not, it becomes a difficult juggling act to bind those moral conventions universally across the human experience. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. What's good for you is fine, but what's good for me is up to me, even if that might conflict with your wishes or your best interests. Again, this new atheism is populist. This is not the highbrow, weighty academic discussions over the rationality of God's existence or the problem of evil. This is a populist and hostile movement. Christians, Dawkins believed that Christians are irrational and dangerous. We are. So he's right there. He even calls the religious instruction of children child abuse. Faith, he says, can be very, very dangerous. Again, he's right. But Dawkins says this in The God Delusion. And deliberately to implant it into the vulnerable mind of an innocent child is a grievous wrong. That Dawkins. So absent any external, incarnational authority, be that the God-man Jesus or his church, absent that incarnational authority, we are left with a path that inevitably, over the course of 500 years since the posting of the 95 Theses, we're inevitably left with a path that leads from individual and democratic religion to a massive division between the enlightened scientific world of reason and the irrational, dangerous, for Dawkins and his ilk, deluded world of religious fanatics. So religious fanatics, what do we do? With due apologies, my preference is to make fun of people like Dawkins. I know this is not a very Christian sort of thing, and it causes me a momentary pause, but not for long. I just can't help it. And the Bible does say, what a fool has said in his heart, there is no God, right? So how long can we suffer this sort of foolishness? Before I poke some fun at him, I think it's worth considering perhaps a bit more sober approach to the problem of atheism. One of my favorite 19th century authors, the individual I think is probably most responsible for helping me see the light of Catholic faith, is, with apologies to Dale, I always have to apologize for this, John Henry Newman. And in Newman's Apologia, a book I first read at Puritan Westminster Seminary. Go figure, right? What was I doing reading the Apologia at Westminster? But in that book, he writes, "As I have already said, there are but two alternatives, the way to Rome and the way to atheism." Think this through. Two alternatives, the way to Rome and the way to atheism. Anglicanism is the halfway house on the one side, and liberalism is the halfway house on the other. This is really a profound comment, I think. Given enough time, all of us will make one choice or the other. And in a world steeped in religious pluralism and denominationalism, there are many choices in addition to Anglicanism, which of course for Newman stands for Protestantism, or even liberalism, that makes this choice difficult. Kind of like the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland. Which way I go depends on where I'm heading. And that question has a number of possible answers. I'm just not sure that people are actually asking the question, where am I going? So what do we do? Well, the Second Vatican Council in 1965, in its pastoral constitution on the Church, the Council states this, quote, "The remedy which must be applied to atheism," and this, by the way, is one of the best statements, I think, in church, official church documents on the problem of atheism. "The remedy which must be applied to atheism, however, is to be sought in a proper presentation of the Church's teaching, as well as in the integral life of the Church and her members." This really says it all, doesn't it? And this is where we need to be, I think. While all of us need to be prepared to answer questions, remember, how old am I? In my 25 years of life, I've rarely encountered a militant atheist. Lots of agnostics and lots of Puritans, and both can be exhausting. But while we do have a responsibility to dialogue in Christian charity with anyone who asks us of the hope that is within us, more importantly is the charge I think we have for a proper presentation of the Church's teachings. And as I'm sure this group knows, this happens in the home first, in the pulpit, in parishes, in religious education that is not watered down to the point of being incoherent drivel, in books, in lectures, and for us modern people, podcasts. You guys know what a podcast is, right? And in institutions like right here in Rochester, St. Irenaeus. All these places where the unadulterated deposit of faith is discussed and explained in the clearest way possible. That's our calling, I think, isn't it? It's our duty. And we need to make this happen if we're going to stay the populist forces of the likes of Dawkins, Hitchens, and other people who will come after them. We forget sometimes about how powerful satire is in winning the masses to a popular cause. I love good satire as much as anyone, but this can be a powerful communicative tool. Just look at the woodcuts from the Reformation. Lucas Cranach, one of the most famous printmakers in the early 16th century, he illustrated Luther's representations of the papacy in 1545. And in one of his illustrations, he had people defecating on the papal coat of arms. I mean, satire can be cutting, it can be funny, very funny. And you can imagine people all over Germany in the 16th century laughing at these caricatures while sloshing down their beers at a local German pub. They may not have been able to articulate a lick of theology, but they got these woodcuts. To me, that's where the danger of these new atheists can be found, in the caricatures that they present in their writings. The council goes on to say, taken as a whole, atheism is not a spontaneous development, but stems from a variety of causes, including a critical reaction against religious beliefs, and in some places against the Christian religion in particular. And indeed, that's true. But again, this only highlights, for me at least, the importance of faithfully teaching our faith and modeling the Christian faith as best we can to our families, neighbors, and friends. Now I realize I'm the only thing that's kind of standing between you and lunch, and I'm getting looks from Lou. So I want to close with a little satire myself, again with due apologies. Thankfully, this is not my satire. This is the work of Orestes Brownson, whom I'm sure that some of you know. He was a 19th century American Catholic convert and writer. And I believe it was in 1847 that he published his little essay on the two brothers, Why Are You a Protestant? And I remember first reading this when I was in the latter stages of my conversion to the Catholic Church and feeling as though it really summed up perfectly my frustration and exhaustion over the hours and days and weeks and years I spent thinking through and writing about, mostly to friends and relatives, writing about this process of conversion. And for the converts out there, I know that you can appreciate what I'm saying here. I'd been on this journey for about a decade. It's a long time. And it began in my seminary years. And I would pore over questions that people had, only to have them jump to the next yes, but what about, which of course would require another dissertation of sorts. The dialogues over the years, I think, were healthy in that they tended to hone my own beliefs and convictions. But as the years went on, it got frustrating. It got very frustrating. And that frustration, I think, is captured beautifully in these comments by Brownson. So I just want to read this to you, if I may. And in place of where he mentions Protestants, just think of these popular atheists, because it's essentially the same mentality. Think of Richard Dawkins. So this is Brownson. Protestant controversialists are well hit off in Lessing's fable of the poodle and the greyhound. How our race is denigrated in this country, said one day a far-traveling poodle to his friend the greyhound. In those distant regions which men call the Indies, there is still a genuine breed of hounds. Hounds, my brother! Hounds! You won't believe it, and yet I've seen it with my own eyes, who do not fear to attack the lion and grapple with him. Do they overcome the lion? Asked the prudent greyhound. Overcome him? Why, as to that I cannot say. But only think, a lion attacked. But, continued the greyhound, if these boasted hounds of yours do not overcome the lion when they attack him, they are no better than we, but a great deal more stupid. Only think. The church attacked. Attack her boldly, with or without success, and you are sure of the admiration of all the poodles. They who attack existing institutions, especially if those institutions are wide and salutary, may always count on the admiration and applause of all the poodles. Fixed and authoritative institutions are offensive to the natural man. They are a restraint, and no man, save so far as assisted and subdued by grace, loves a restraint. Remember Belloc. And there's no one that has not a natural repugnance to whatever curbs his lawless desire and licentious passions, or interposes an obstacle to his living as he lists. In every community, because in every natural man there is always a predisposition, more or less manifest, to rebel against the existing order and to welcome and adhere to those who are prepared to war against it, especially to credit whatever may be advanced to its prejudice. They who attack the existing order, appealing to this predisposition, have the appearance of attacking tyranny and oppression, and of being champions of freedom and justice. And this fact renders them respectable, almost sacred, in the eyes of the multitude, in the eyes of the poodles. Their position, moreover, permits them to assume a bold and daring tone, to make broad and sweeping assertions, and to forego clear and exact statements, and enclose rigid logic. They can declaim, denounce, be impassioned, and affect all the eloquence of virtuous indignation. The eloquence of denunciation is the easiest thing in the world to command, for it appeals directly to those elements of our nature which lie nearest the surface and which are the most easily moved. And weak men prefer it and seek to possess it. But he who defends authority labors always under a disadvantage. He has an unpopular cause. To the superficial, they are always the great majority. He is the advocate of tyranny, the enemy of liberty, warring against the best interest in the true dignity and glory of his race. He can appeal to no popular passion, use no burning words, and pour forth no strains of indignant eloquence. He cannot speak to the multitude. He must speak to sober sense, to prudent justice and judgment, and to aim to convince the reason instead of moving the sensibility or inflaming the passions. His words, to all but few, are cold and spiritless, tame and commonplace. For the foaming tankard or sparkling goblet with which the popular declaimer regales his auditors, he has only the simple water from a spring. He must subdue in tone, measured in his speech, exact in his statements, rigid in his reasoning, and few only will listen to him, and fewer still can appreciate him. He who for years has been on the side opposed to authority, and by his bold and daring declamation roused up a whole ocean of popular passion, and at every word brought an echo from the universal heart of humanity, no sooner finds himself on the other side than all his marvelous eloquence is lost, and he is pronounced by the very public which had hailed him as a second Cicero or Demosthenes, cold and weak. No matter how true and just his thought, how deep and searching his wit, how wise and prudent his counsel, how lucid and exact his statements, he can excite no passion, move no sensibility, and bring no popular echo. The spell is broken, his magic is over, and his power to charm is gone forever. Then again, the poodles regard the lion attacked as the lion vanquished. They hold every objection boldly and confidently made to be true, till it is proved to be false. In this fact, and the tendency of the great majority to regard every objection made to existing authority as well-founded till the contrary is shown, lies in the secret of the Protestant Reformation, or atheism. To this the Reformers owed their brilliant success. They well understood that their objections to the church would be credited by the multitudes till refuted. It was a matter of little importance, so far as their success was concerned, whether their objections were true or false. What they wanted simply was that the objections be made, but not easily refuted, susceptible of being proposed in a popular form, but not susceptible of a popular answer. In the 16th century, by the way, few had access to the Latin sources that these reformers were using. Such objections, they employed their wit in inventing and their skill in activity in circulating. A lie happily conceived, adroitly told, and well stuck to was in their case hardly, if at all, inferior to the truth. And it must be concluded that they had a marvelous facility in inventing lies and adhering to them when they had once told them. Whoever coolly examines their objections to the church will readily perceive that they are all framed with respect, not to truth, but to the difficulty of refutation, and on the principle that a lie is as good as the truth until it is contradicted. Gloriously did they chuckle, we may fancy, when the father of lies helped them to prepare a popular objection to which no popular answer could be returned. Boldly or with brazen imprudence they threw it out, sent it forth on its errand of mischief, and then laughed at the heavy answer which in process of time came lumbering back, those dissertations of answers. The objection was made in a few words, on a loose sheet, and wafted by the wind of controversy through every land, town, village, and hamlet, to every door, and became universally known. The answer followed in a ponderous quarto or folio, all bristling with scholastic formula and scholastic distinctions, formidable even to the professional reader. Its circulation was necessarily limited. Few only heard of it, fewer read it, and still fewer were able to appreciate it. The authors of the objection safely ignored it, or if they could not, they misrepresented it, denied its conclusiveness, or even made it the occasion of a new triumph with their own followers. Or when they could neither conceal the fact of their answer nor its conclusiveness, they could still count on the poodles, who would insist that there must have been something in the objection, or else it would not have required so elaborate and so learned a refutation. The lion had been attacked, and that alone was enough. So, reworking Chesterton's words, one of my own adventures into the modern world of atheism concerned a comment on Richard Dawkins, who had written a book about the God delusion. I happened to remark that it would be much more interesting if God wrote a book about the Dawkins delusion. With due respect to the atheist hounds in our present culture, your poodles, Mr. Dawkins, may salute you for a time. Well done. But as Augustine said centuries ago, God made us, and our hearts will not rest until they have found their rest in Him. Thank you.